We'll let you open it in just a second. So I'll start with you, Jane, just because of the microphones on that end of the table too. And I think I failed to mention what my day job is. Actually, I have the pleasure of leading the patient advocacy function globally at Celgene. And so I love to engage with the advocacy community. I have worked on and am still working on data sharing initiatives with multiple companies and with multiple people in this room. And so I have my feet in both camps. And so as I think, Jane, about the people that I would see in the room that need to learn about this, I think we had a discussion a little bit during the break about who is the target audience for this. So maybe I'll ask a question, Jane, as you touched on it a little bit, is who would you like to sit next to at a meeting like this? You're a steering committee member of this particular project, but who do you see sitting next to you? You come to this to both learn, but you're part of the teaching as well. So how does someone come into this that has a little bit of interest, some initiation to come to the program, but what does the person look like as they come to the program?
Okay. Well, Cindy asked, why would anyone want to spend 2.5 days? Excuse me? Oh, right, with me. Well, that's a whole nother question, but we won't address that. I think that we will have a lot of interest in being part of this program, at least in the cancer community. I've already had more than 20 people say, how do I get into it? And I think that one of the things I hope we don't have is that we go after cancer, all kinds of advocacy organizations, and they put one of their staff people on who have so many other things to do that they're just doing it to get a peek. I hope that those organizations will go back to their constituents and say, now what is this other person who doesn't like to do fundraising and who doesn't like to do runs and walks, but who really likes to get into the nitty-gritty? They might even have some relevant or peripherally relevant background, and they really want to spend 2.5 days doing this. So those are sort of the type of people. The other thing, and the discussion hinted at this a lot, actually a model that I'm going to propose is that we don't ask for advocates, we ask for organizations that want to get advocates involved to say how they want to involve the advocate, and if they have an advocate they think would be relevant, we take that person into the program, and if they don't, we ask them some telling questions about the type of person they're looking for, and we find matches from people who might apply. So I think, number one, someone who has the time and inclination to put something, to get involved in projects. Number two, has the curiosity to engage. And I'll stop there.
That's great. Jane, thank you very much. That's perfect and very helpful as we start to develop the who in the audience. Rachel, with the microphone in your hand, I'll go with you. I think what you're doing at Pcora and through PcoreNet, one of the things that you said is that you're both teaching through your equation here, but also you're learning at the same time about how all these data are collected. Can you give some examples of some potential data that you're collecting, how it will be used, and how those data will be used by the patients that see it?
So that's a complicated question, so I'm going to unpack it.
Ask all three questions all in one.
On our CDRN side, which is our big health system side, we're actually not collecting data. The data is collected at the point of care. It goes into EHRs. It goes into claims. The PCORNet side there is kind of the curation of the data. Yep. This data, for the privacy and security reasons, always stays behind institutional firewalls. And the reason it's queryable is that it gets organized in this common data model, and so the pipelines are open, and so all kinds of research questions can be asked on that data. I mean, starting from very simple counts of patients with different kinds of diseases to being able to use it to identify potential patients that could participate in a trial, and then there's obviously processes of consent, et cetera, for recruitment, but there's a sort of we're still testing this. There's a hope that we'll be able to accelerate clinical trial recruitment because we'll be able to do things a little differently. So that's on the sort of the large health system side. That's it's always de-identified data until we're able to go through permissions to do the identification. Our front door, which is kind of opening this summer, we hope that any kind of groups, organizations, advocacy, industry are going to be able to knock on the door and sort of work with our teams to develop the questions and then have the questions be run or the studies be run. So that's on that side. On the PPRN side, on the patient side, as I say, it's really been a large experiment, and it's been a large experiment also in collaboration and looking to see if very different models of groups that have come together can actually share learnings on how they're doing things and pick and choose from each other and then accelerate their process. They've all worked together, patients and researchers, to develop research questions that were priorities for their communities, and we've just funded 5 large demonstration projects on the PPRN community to answer questions. So we have questions like, are using biologics long-term going to cause cancer in my kid? That's a big question that some communities have. So so they've worked together to develop that, and they're going to run it now through PCORNet. We've just launched a very large study on 2 different types of mindfulness approaches across all our PPRNs. It was so sort of increasing well-being and decreasing stress was a common question that every disease condition represented here, including patients, caregivers, families have. And part of our experiment is these folks have already kind of flagged their interest in research. Now we're about to run a large trial. Is it true that they're actually going to be interested in participating in this trial, and are we going to recruit to this trial faster than we would have with a regular traditional trial? But we actually, for a lot of these questions, we don't know the answer yet, and there's a lot of kind of still hope and aspiration, but a lot of learnings to do, and I think the key here is to really set up communities that can learn from each other very quickly, so that they're not all reinventing the wheel every time they're trying to do something new.
Yeah. That's great.
And just in closing, I'll say, I think the secret sauce is really the multi-stakeholder groups that come together. That it does make the process a little bit more difficult. It can make it a little longer, but the richness of what comes out after these discussions and everything's been unpacked is really phenomenal compared to just siloed groups that are doing things the old way.
No, that's great. And it's a strong desire of this program as well to ensure that the graduates of this program are those that are informed enough to have the knowledge that there's information out there that they can access, or an organization to whom that they can go to ask the question. I think those are great examples. And Sally will pull the microphone back closer over this way. So Amy, I think you know you're next. But Sally, you have no shortage of data volunteers with 430,000 people in your database. I'll tell a story I think I shared with Sally, is that about 7 or 8 years ago, Patients Like Me was with me at another company, and I had some of our development scientists in the room with me, and colleagues of Sally's were showing longitudinal patient data and in various disease areas and where they were going to expand to, and everyone was nodding yes, that looks great, and the Patients Like Me team left the room, and I was still in the room, and the clinical scientist and the development scientist said, how are we going to register that? Right? So how is that going to be part of my filing? And thanks, Joel, that was really great, but okay, 7 or 8 years ago. Now, with all the data that you're collecting, we're clamoring to get to you. So I think that's great. One of the questions, and it kind of getting onto the trial process, which is another application that we hope that we can help patients and patient organizations understand that trials are part of their treatment, not a last resort. While you're working on your trial access project, how do you anticipate the data that you're collecting from patients to help people navigate not only the selection process, but the retention process, the completion process, and asking questions at the end of, my data went in, what does it look like on the way out?
Well, what we're learning, first of all, are the preferences that people have about the kinds of things that they make decisions about to even participate in a trial at all. So we're understanding that, a lot of it isn't as, I think a lot of researchers might believe that they're not getting paid for it. That's not an issue for people. The issues for people are really more about the, am I going to learn something about my condition? Will what I do and participate in help someone else like me at some future point? Will I get some results back? And I was just looking at some of this data the other day, and it was interesting because I mentioned before about 56% of our patients have never been approached about participating in a research clinical trial, and yet one of the most important things that those who have participated in a trial expect as a result of being in one is to get the data back, to understand what the findings are. They, in maybe 30% of the cases actually got anything back, and some of it might have been a mug or something, but it wasn't necessarily the findings that they were interested in learning about. So I think where we are now pushing the envelope is really helping patients not only think about clinical trials differently, but understand that they actually can state preferences, and that should influence not only the design at the beginning, but all the way through into the post-market arena of this. And that's where I think people really do feel then there's an investment made. We are, and I think you raise a really good point. I've been with patients like me for 8 years, and for the first 4 years or so, every time I would talk to a group, you'd see the eyes rolling, like, oh, really? What are we ever going to do with this data? In the last couple of years, not only I think has industry also been really interested in this, but government entities are interested in it. ONC today is right now reviewing protocols for RFPs for a policy framework about patient-generated health data. FDA is working with us on a research collaboration, and more recently with Flatiron, to think about how do we start looking at some of this data. How do we characterize it? What are the ways that we need to think about it in terms of understanding it? So patients are also beginning to understand that their data has value. And actually that's been part of our job. Part of my job has been to be out here all the time saying patient data has value. We need to find ways of creating the structures that allow that value to be illuminated in a way that's rigorous enough and attentive enough to standards so that the data does become something people don't roll their eyes at any longer, that it really becomes something that is as important, it's equally important as any clinical data point that we would have access to. Claims data and others, even prescribing data, is not data that's helpful for decision making for patients. That's helpful for decision making for payers and for other groups. So it's actually the kinds of things that people really make decisions about on a day-to-day basis that we have been missing for so long. So we welcome the opportunity for this sort of, this influx of people having this great interest now. And where we, I think, feel greatly prepared is that we now have a cohort of people who are excited about this. I mentioned before we have a team of advisors that we recruit for every year. I've done it now for a couple of years, and that application process, the first year had about 200 applicants, the second year about 500 or 600. Last year we had 1,500 applicants for 14 slots. So the word within the community is growing that you can be a part of this group and have a voice. Those 1,500 don't get lost to some use. I had a request from FDA recently for a patient they needed with a particular diagnosis. They couldn't find that kind of patient anywhere. I went and looked in our team of advisors and found 4, and found one who was in the DC area who not only when I wrote to him that afternoon, wrote right back to me and said, of course, I'm happy to help, anything I can do. So it's really being able to dig into that kind of resource that I think will be incredibly powerful for patients to feel like I do have a voice, someone's giving me an opportunity to have it, whether it's patients like me or PPRNs through PCORNet or other ways of doing it. Patients have that voice now, and they're able to say it and say the things that they need to say in ways that researchers, clinicians, and others who need to see it in some structured way can make sense of it. So
yeah, great, Sally. And I think like the name of your organization is Patients Like Me, but that's a great example is that there are patients like you, and I think the longitudinal data and the specific data that you do collect is incredibly valuable and a great demonstration, and no surprise that it may end up in some of our curriculum here, so thank you. So I'm going to keep going on to the patient-reported outcomes and patient preference-related question with Amy, and we didn't practice this, so she's looking at me like, what are you going to ask me? But I think... Yeah, no. There are examples actually where patient-reported outcomes have been collected. They have been generated using very specific validated tools, and they're collected on a particular disease area. They're entered into a clinical trial. They are reviewed by the FDA, and they end up in a label of a particular product. All a very systematic process, and one that is very unusual, and there's only a handful of examples that do that. So Amy, using some of the data that you're collecting now, and you're collecting all kinds of different things, I'd like to ask you 2 questions. One, the extent of the data you collect, it comes from physicians, it comes from EHRs, it comes from payers, it comes from all over the place. So one of the things that you and I have spoken about is with the multitude of data in various formats and collecting various things, first question is, how do you make sense of all those data? And once you get them collected, are you able to identify patient preferences, perhaps physician preferences, and can the community, which you're serving, they're serving the pharmaceutical community, they're serving multiple communities, can those users start to make decisions based on the preferences that you identify?
Wow. Okay. So I'm going to start with how do you go from sort of messy data that's being aggregated across multiple sources to something that's consistent and structured in a way that you can make sense of it. And this is fundamentally the challenge at PCORNet. It's the challenge at Flatiron. It's the challenge everywhere when we think about how do we come to data and big data that we can make sense of it. There are a number of ways of solving this problem. So there's not only one answer. And for example, you may solve it in a distributed network, or you may try and solve it by putting all the data in one place and mapping it to a common model. Regardless, there's a few fundamentals that I think need to go into the process of solving it. One is that you need a common vocabulary to which you can understand what's going on. And Sally alluded to that, for example, with some of the work they were doing in patients like me. So there needs to be some kind of at least centralized common vocabulary, even if it's a distributed model and you actually have an equal sign between your vocabulary and that common vocabulary. And we see that even in patient-reported outcomes, where, for example, part of the whole PROMISE network is to create the equal sign between different kinds of surveys. Another thing that you need to do is basically have a common framework for credibility. And if we think about, and I'm going to keep mapping back to the patient-reported outcome stories. So if we think about patient-reported outcomes in a common framework of credibility, we call these psychometrics, and we understand this is what reliability looks like, and this is what validity looks like, and then we can assess each particular kind of survey instrument or tool within that framework. And some tools are great for communicating on a day-to-day basis, but not precise enough for the FDA. And other tools are precise enough for the FDA within a common framework. And so we need sort of a credibility framework that we can use. In addition, we need a communication framework that we can use. So we now know that this particular piece of information has been used and led to this particular result. We need a way of communicating that result that's broadly understood. We saw the same thing in patient-reported outcomes. We may have a quality of life score that comes off of a quality of life scale that's a highly credible scale, but it doesn't mean anything until you put that piece of information within context that real people can use. And we have the same issue all the way across big data. So as we think about generating approaches that aggregate across big data systems, we need to aggregate to a common framework. We need to make sure that data are organized and readily analyzable. We need to understand how credible the data sets are for the task or purpose at hand. Sometimes that purpose is regulatory, sometimes that purpose is not, and that's fine. And then we need to be able to communicate it. That's the kind of big data side. The other part is, can we get down to issues like patient preference, et cetera, when you're aggregating across these? If you apply that same framework, the answer is yes, but with differing levels of precision depending on the underlying data source and the question at hand. So for example, if we want to know why doctors decided to discontinue this particular medicine, we actually can map back to their medical case notes and get that answer to a pretty strong degree, but it's not as good as asking the doctor on that day because it's hard to exactly map the categories. But you can make a strong inference there. If you want to know how this patient was feeling and you map to the doctor notes, it's probably not a great place to get how this person was feeling. And so that's the reason why I'm going to keep pushing to go back to how do we get this information directly from the patient. If we want to know whether or not this person's glucose is mapping consistently across time, that information is highly credible coming in from laboratory data and tells a great story about how that patient is experiencing day-to-day glucose changes and also might wrap up into, for example, hemoglobin A1C as a summary variable.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to